Indira hissed that I was a parasite, then took a $5 million bet on my death. She wanted me independent? Fine. Now she's screaming as the police shatter her gilded world, and I, Catherine, am finally the one in control. It all began with a dinner that felt more like a trial, under the suffocating weight of a family tradition. The mahogany table stretched before me like a polished dark lake, reflecting the flickering glow of a dozen beeswax candles. In Greenwich, Connecticut, Thanksgiving isn't just a holiday, it's a performance. The air in the mansion was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary turkey and the sharp, expensive musk of aged Bordeaux. Everything was surgically perfect. The silver was polished to a blinding sheen, and the laughter flowing from our guests sounded as rehearsed as a Broadway opening night. I stood near the sideboard, a silent shadow in a room filled with giants. Have you ever felt like a stranger in the very room where your name is etched into the silver? My mother, Indira, sat at the head of the table, her spine as rigid as the high-backed velvet chair. She was old money personified, refined, porcelain-skinned, and utterly lethal. She held court with the effortless grace of a queen, her voice a melodic chime as she boasted about the family's latest acquisition of a beachfront estate in the Hamptons. "We believe in preserving legacies," she told the table, her eyes sweeping over the guests but never once landing on me. I moved quietly, a ghost in a silk dress, ensuring that every crystal glass remained full. I wasn't a daughter tonight. I was a hospitality insurance policy. As the youngest, I had learned early on that my role was to be the glue that held the facade together. I watched the way my sister Cressida leaned in to laugh at a guest's mediocre joke, her diamonds catching the light. We don't inherit the land. We only borrow the pride of those who built it, and tonight, that pride was suffocating. I caught my reflection in the heavy gilded mirror across the room. My eyes were tired, mirroring a soul that had spent too many years playing the part of the invisible pillar. Looking back now, I should have seen that the foundation was already crumbling. The tension in the room shifted when Indira noticed a slight tilt in the center floral arrangement. It was a detail so minute that no guest would have seen it, but to Indira, it was a crack in her armor. She didn't call a servant. She called me. "Catherine, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. The table went quiet. All eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mix of pity and polite boredom. Dignity is not found in how we are treated, but in how we refuse to react. I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the Persian rug. As I reached for the vase, Indira's hand moved with a calculated, predatory elegance. She didn't just point. She lunged. In an instant, her vintage Cabernet Sauvignon tipped forward. I watched it in slow motion, the dark, blood-red liquid arching through the air before splashing violently against the pale silk of my cream dress. The stain bloomed across my chest like a visceral wound. A collective gasp echoed around the mahogany lake. For a second, the only sound was the rhythmic drip of wine hitting the hardwood floor. Indira let out a light, airy laugh that felt like a jagged blade. "Oh, Catherine, look at you," she sighed, dabbing her own mouth with a lace napkin. "Our Catherine is so smart with her books and her data, yet so hopelessly clumsy with life." She turned to the guests, her smile widening. "She's lucky she has us to cling to, or she'd be lost in the real world. Imagine her trying to navigate a crisis without her mother's hand to hold." The humiliation was public, precise, and entirely intentional. I didn't flush. I didn't stammer. I simply stood there, soaked in the scent of fermented grapes and betrayal. I looked at the woman who had given me life and saw a stranger counting her wins. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. Instead of apologizing or shrinking away, I took a deep breath. I remembered the old saying that the strongest trees are those that grow against the wind. I offered a small, steady smile to the elderly woman seated next to me, whose face was etched with genuine concern. "Please, don't let my clumsiness interrupt your meal," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen pond. "The wine is far too good to be wasted on an apology." I excused myself with a slight, regal nod. As I walked out of the dining room, my mother's laughter trailed after me, a sharp sound that echoed in the high ceilings of the foyer. Each step I took felt heavier than the last. I reached the grand staircase and stopped, looking at the family portraits lining the wall. Generations of men and women who valued the name above the person. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone to destroy your soul twice. I had spent 24 years trying to be the good daughter, the one who absorbed the blows so the family wouldn't have to. I reached for my phone in my clutch, a habit born of a decade of being the family's unofficial fixer. A notification was waiting for me, a red alert from my credit monitoring app. My heart stuttered. Unauthorized inquiry. Personal loan application. Status pending. The timestamp was from 10 minutes ago. Someone in this house, while I was pouring wine and being humiliated, was attempting to use my identity as a financial life raft. I didn't feel panic. I felt a cold, terrifying clarity. My kindness had been mistaken for weakness for far too long. I reached my bedroom, the sanctuary I had worked so hard to maintain within this gilded cage. I didn't cry. Instead, I stripped off the ruined silk dress and threw it into the trash can without a second thought. I needed to change, but my mind was already moving toward the library. I heard the distant, heavy creak of the library doors downstairs, the sound of a secret being shared. Then came the voices. Indira's sharp, demanding tone, and Soren's low, urgent murmur. They were beckoning me for a private family matter. That's where it all started. I descended the grand staircase, my heels clicking against the cold marble, feeling the damp, wine-stained silk of my dress cling to my skin like a second, unwanted layer. The air shifted as I approached the library. The festive noise of the ballroom faded, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I pushed the mahogany doors open, the scent of old leather and expensive brandy hitting me like a physical blow. Indira sat behind the massive oak desk, her posture regal but her eyes burning with a desperate, predatory heat. Soren stood by the window, his back to me, though I could see his reflection in the glass. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, but they were trembling. He was a man drowning in his own choices, looking for a life raft, and I knew exactly who they intended to sink to keep themselves afloat. "Close the door, Catherine," my mother said, her voice dropping the melodic socialite chime for a tone of gravelly command. I complied, the heavy click of the latch echoing like the start of an interrogation. Family should be a sanctuary, a place where the world stops hurting you, not a cage where the bars are forged from shared DNA. I walked to the center of the room, keeping my spine straight despite the exhaustion clawing at my nerves. Soren finally turned, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He poured a glass of amber liquid, the decanter clinking against the rim, a telltale sign of a man whose nerves were frayed to the breaking point. "We need to talk about the legacy of this house," Indira began, leaning forward into the pool of light cast by the desk lamp. She spoke of protecting the patriarch, of the sacrifices made to keep our name in the high circles of Greenwich. It was a well-rehearsed script, designed to trigger my sense of duty, to make me feel small and indebted. But as she spoke, I felt a clinical detachment taking over. I wasn't listening to a mother, I was observing a predator circling its prey. Looking back now, I realized that the warmth in her voice was never love. It was just the bait. Soren stepped forward then, sliding a stack of thick, legal-grade documents across the leather-topped desk. "It's a health insurance rider for your father, Catherine," he said, his voice a bit too high, a bit too eager. "The underwriters require a younger co-signer to guarantee the long-term premiums. It's a formality, really, to ensure he gets the care he deserves in his final years." I looked at the papers, my heart hammering a slow, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I've always been good with numbers, with the fine print that people hope you'll skip when you're tired or emotional. As I scanned the pages, the legal jargon began to scream at me. This wasn't a health insurance rider. Hidden beneath the flowery language of familial support and legacy protection was a high-interest personal loan agreement and a comprehensive lien on my future earnings and any assets I might one day inherit. They weren't asking for my help, they were asking for my life. In the United States, signing a document under such blatant misrepresentation is a criminal act of fraud, but they believed I was still that clumsy girl who couldn't balance a checkbook without help. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the papers back at them. Instead, I reached out and gently touched the cool surface of the mahogany desk, looking at my mother with a sense of genuine, soul-deep pity. True wealth isn't found in a Greenwich zip code or a diversified portfolio. It's being able to close your eyes at night with a clear conscience, a treasure they had sold for pennies long ago. "Have you ever wondered?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper but cutting through the tension. "What it costs a person to look at their own child and see nothing but a blank check?" Indira's eyes narrowed, the mask of maternal concern beginning to crack around the edges. Soren shifted his weight, his shadow looming large against the bookshelves. I picked up the gold-plated pen they had placed so carefully by my hand, feeling its weight. I thought of the years I had spent fixing their messes, quiet and compliant, hoping that one day my service would buy me a seat at the table of their hearts. But the table was empty. Would you sign away your future just to buy a temporary peace for people who would never do the same for you? I put the pen down with a soft, definitive click. "I love this family enough to tell you no," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the anger they expected. "To sign this wouldn't be helping you, Mother. It would be enabling the very greed that is currently hollowing out this house. I won't be the fuel for your fire anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the moment I realized that I wasn't just refusing a loan. I was declaring my independence from a lifetime of psychological indentured servitude. The air in the library soured instantly. Indira didn't cry or plead. Her facade simply shattered, leaving behind a hiss of pure, unadulterated hostility. "You ungrateful, selfish girl," she whispered, her face contorting into something I barely recognized. She began to list the costs of my upbringing, the private schools, the European vacations, the very air I breathed under her roof. She spoke as if my existence was a debt I was legally obligated to repay with my soul. Soren moved then, stepping between me and the door, a brief, pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. I stood my ground, my posture regal and my breathing rhythmic. I didn't fear him. I had already scanned the room, noting the small green light on the hidden security camera nestled in the corner of the bookshelf, the one my father had installed years ago for insurance purposes. Every word, every threat, and every fraudulent document was being recorded. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of my own escape. I realized then that their power only existed as long as I agreed to be afraid. And tonight, I was finally out of fear. Indira lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a strength born of pure desperation. Her nails dug into my skin, leaving crescent moon marks that burned. "You think you're so smart, Catherine?" she spat, her face inches from mine. "You are nothing without this house. You are a shadow of our name. Now get out there and show our guests we are still a family. Smile, pour the wine, and pretend you're lucky to be here. Or don't bother coming back inside, because from this second on, you don't exist to me." She shoved me toward the door, her eyes cold enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I didn't look back as I walked out. I stepped through the grand foyer, past the portraits of ancestors who probably would have done the exact same thing to their own kin. I pushed through the front doors, the cold night air hitting my face with the sweetness of a long-awaited rescue. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had the truth, and in a world built on lies, that was the most dangerous weapon of all. I walked toward my car, knowing the bridge behind me was already in flames, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to put it out. I pushed through the heavy library doors and stepped back into the blinding brilliance of the ballroom. The scent of vanilla candles and expensive perfume felt thinner now, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. Behind me, I could hear the rhythmic, predatory click of Indira's heels. She didn't look like a woman who had just failed to commit fraud. She looked like a general preparing for a final charge. I navigated the crowd, feeling the eyes of the Greenwich elite prickling against my skin like needles. To them, I was just Catherine, the quiet one, the shadow. But shadows only exist when there is a light worth blocking, and tonight, the light was about to burn out. Indira didn't go to her seat. Instead, she took center stage near the orchestra, signaling for a silence that fell instantly and heavily. She raised a crystal flute, her smile radiant and utterly false. "Friends, family," she began, her voice projecting with practiced grace. We all know Catherine has been going through some difficult transitions recently. Mental fatigue can be so taxing on a young woman of her sensitivities. I watched Cressida leaning against a marble pillar, whispering into the ear of a local socialite. The smirk on my sister's face told me everything. In this house, loyalty wasn't a virtue. It was a currency I no longer possessed. I stood perfectly still, my fingers brushing the cool stem of a wine glass. I reflected on the weight of the silver in my hand, thinking about the generations who had toasted to their own greatness in this hall. We are often told that blood is thicker than water, but tonight I realized that water is much easier to wash away than the poison of a false legacy. I looked at the faces in the crowd, men and women who prized their reputations over the truth. Looking back now, I should have seen that their silence was a form of consent for the execution about to take place. And so, Indira continued, her eyes finally locking onto mine with a chilling intensity. I'd like to propose a toast to my youngest. May she finally find the gratitude to appreciate what has been built for her. She waited, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for the humble nod, the tearful thank you, the final submission to the contract I had refused to sign. I didn't move. I didn't raise my glass. I simply looked at her, my silence a wall she couldn't climb. It was the first time I had ever truly stood my ground in front of her audience. The facade didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Indira's hand trembled, the champagne sloshing against the rim of her glass. Her thin veil of civility snapped with a sound that felt like a gunshot. "You think you're so smart, Catherine!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and silencing the last of the background music. Always judging us with those silent, arrogant eyes. You think you're better than the family that fed you? Then be independent. Go out there and pay for your own life. Stop clinging to us like a parasite. The room went dead silent. It was a mic drop moment of pure, unadulterated cruelty. I saw guests pull their shoulders back, physically distancing themselves from me as if my sudden lack of maternal favor was a contagious disease. No one spoke. No one defended the girl who had spent the last 3 hours ensuring their glasses were never empty. But I didn't flinch. I didn't shout back. I stood tall, absorbing the blow like a mountain absorbs a storm. The greatest revenge is not to be like your enemy, but to be exactly who they claimed you couldn't be. I realized then that this wasn't a tragedy. It was a graduation. I looked at the heirloom gold bracelet on my wrist, a heavy, ornate piece Indira had insisted I wear to represent the bloodline. It had always felt like a leash. I slowly unclasped it, the metal feeling cold and lifeless in my palm. I walked toward the main dining table and placed it gently on a silver tray. The clink of the gold against the silver sounded like a bell tolling for the end of my life as a victim. I felt a profound, quiet sense of liberation beginning to bloom in my chest. I turned back to my mother, who was breathing hard, her face a mask of fury and sudden flickering doubt. I looked at her with a gaze of pure, detached kindness. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice calm and carrying through the hushed ballroom. "You just gave me the one thing I was too afraid to take for myself, the truth. I hope one day you find a love that doesn't require a contract, and a life that doesn't require a victim." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. Her silence was the only confession I required. I turned and began my walk toward the grand mahogany doors. My damp, red-stained dress trailed behind me like a royal cape. No longer a mark of shame, but a badge of survival. I felt the judgment of the room falling away with every step I took. These people didn't matter. This house didn't matter. I reached the doors and pushed them open, the sound of the ballroom fading into a dull hum. I took nothing but my phone and the keys to the small, used car I had paid for with 3 years of hidden overtime pay. I was leaving with my soul intact. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the cold Greenwich air hit my face with the force of a physical awakening. The rain had turned into a steady, rhythmic downpour, washing the scent of the mansion from my skin. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the dark driveway. I realized I had no home to go to, no safety net, and no family left to call my own. But as I took a deep breath, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even known I was carrying. I had finally found myself. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I walked to my car, my heels splashing in the puddles. I looked back at the mansion one last time. The lights were still blazing, the party continuing as if I had never existed. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been erased, and it was the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to me. I got into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine hummed to life, a humble, honest sound. That was where it all started, and I knew I would never look back. The rain began to fall even harder as I pulled out of the driveway, the lights of the mansion fading in my rearview mirror like a dying star. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in my life, I was the one steering. Have you ever lived a moment where you lost everything, only to realize that everything was the very thing holding you underwater? I drove into the darkness, the red stain on my dress a reminder of the price I had paid for my freedom. The rain lashing against my windshield felt like 1,000 tiny hammers trying to break through to the truth I carried inside. I didn't drive toward a hotel or a familiar street. I drove until the gilded gates of Greenwich were nothing but a bitter memory in my rearview mirror. The neon sign of a roadside diner flickered through the downpour, a tired, buzzing halo of blue and pink. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, old grease, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the storm. Lacey was sitting in a corner booth, her face etched with a worry that felt more like home than any mansion ever had. I slid into the booth, my wine-stained silk dress clinging to me like a cold, wet shroud. I looked like a survivor of a shipwreck rather than a socialite who had just left a gala. Lacey pushed a mug of steaming coffee toward me without a word, her eyes scanning the red marks on my arm where Indira's nails had dug in. I stared at my reflection in the dark, rain-streaked window. A bird sitting on a tree is never afraid of the branch breaking, because her trust is not on the branch, but on her own wings. For 24 years, I had trusted the branch. Tonight, I was finally testing my wings. I realized then that home isn't a zip code or a property deed. It's the quiet space where you no longer have to watch your back. "Catherine, your hands are shaking," Lacey whispered, reaching across the laminate table. I looked down, surprised to see the rhythmic tremor in my fingers. It wasn't fear, it was the adrenaline of a prisoner who had finally found the key. I had left the mansion with nothing but a handbag and a laptop, but inside that laptop was the digital heart of the family empire. I wasn't just running, I was taking the ledger of their sins with me. Lacey opened her own bag and pulled out a secure external drive. "I did what you asked," she said, her voice dropping to a cautious murmur. I hadn't just walked out on a whim. For months, I had been quietly mirroring the family's main server onto a secure cloud drive, a digital midnight exodus that Indira and Soren never suspected. They thought I was clumsy and dependent, but while they were busy polishing their reputations, I was auditing their souls. I opened my laptop and felt the cool glow of the screen illuminate the dark circles under my eyes. The logs were indisputable. I showed Lacey the trail of Soren's midnight logins, the way he had used my stolen credentials to authorize high-risk transfers and offshore inquiries. Under U.S. federal law, unauthorized access and identity theft are felony offenses that carry weight far beyond a family spat. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a whistleblower. "I don't want to destroy them, Lacey," I said, my voice steady despite the storm outside. "But I refuse to be the currency that pays for their sins. I forgive their desperation, but I will not be their collateral." Lacey began digging deeper into the encrypted folders I had extracted before the library confrontation. Her face went pale, the light from the screen casting long, ghostly shadows across her features. She clicked on a file titled Maintenance that was hidden within a life insurance directory. My breath caught in my throat as she opened a high-resolution photo of my car's undercarriage, specifically the brake lines. "Catherine," she breathed, her voice trembling. "They didn't just want your credit. They took out a $5 million life insurance policy in your name 3 weeks ago." The air in the diner suddenly felt freezing. I stared at the screen, at the legal documents where Indira was listed as the sole beneficiary and Soren as the primary witness. It was a descent into a madness I had tried so hard to pretend didn't exist. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about the people we love, hoping they'll change. But a wolf doesn't stop being a wolf just because you want it to be a dog. They hadn't just been using my name, they had been appraising the value of my absence. I felt a cold, hard stone settle in my chest, replacing the last shred of maternal hope I had been clinging to. Looking back now, that moment changed everything. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was existential. They were willing to erase me from the physical world to keep their gilded cage intact. I thought about the breakfast we had shared that morning, the way Indira had smiled as she poured my tea, already knowing that my life was a line item on a balance sheet. The realization didn't break me. It forged me into something sharper. "We go to the state police," Lacey said, her hand reaching for her phone. I stopped her, my grip firm. I needed a moment of silence to let the Catherine they knew die completely. I wasn't going to just hide in a witness protection program or cry in a lawyer's office. I was going to strike back where it hurt their old money ego the most. The public record. I closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed through the quiet diner like a gunshot. I had been their shield for too long. Now, I was the storm. The diner's neon sign hummed, a lonely sound in the Connecticut night. I looked at Lacey and saw the reflection of a true friend, someone who valued me more than a legacy. I realized then that my life wasn't just being used, it was being appraised, and it was time to show them that I was a debt they could never afford to settle. I stood up, the red stain on my dress now looking like a badge of honor. We walked out into the rain, leaving the warmth of the diner behind for the cold, hard path of justice. I stood by the window of Lacey's high-rise apartment in New Haven, watching the cold, gray light of the dawn creep over the city. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, but the chill had settled deep into my bones. My dress, the cream silk that was supposed to represent family grace, sat in a heap on the floor, its red wine stain now a dark, crusty reminder of the execution I had survived. I had realized then that my life wasn't just being used, it was being appraised, and it was time to show them that Catherine was a debt they could never afford to settle. I sat down at Lacey's desk, the hum of the cooling fans in her server tower the only music in the room. My fingers hovered over the keys, a rhythmic anticipation building in my chest. I wasn't here to steal their money or burn their house down with my own hands. I was here to revoke my consent. For years, I had allowed them to use my social security number as a skeleton key for their fraudulent architecture. Tonight, I was changing the locks. I activated the Digital Assassin Protocol, a sequence of pre-written scripts designed to flag every offshore account and shell LLC tied to my identity. Within minutes, the digital shadow I had been forced to cast began to retract. True power isn't about how much you can take from others, it's about how much you no longer need from them. I watched the screen as red flags sprouted across their financial network like digital blood. Indira's luxury credit lines, Soren's wire transfers, and the family's high-limit accounts were being automatically suspended for manual federal review. I wasn't taking their wealth. I was simply taking back my soul. Every click of the mouse felt like a surgical strike against the parasite that had been feeding on my future. That's where the real reckoning began. By 6 a.m., the counterattack arrived. My phone, sitting on the edge of the desk, began to vibrate with a violence that made the wood hum. I didn't need to answer it to know that the empire had found its credit cards declined. Indira didn't cower or call to apologize. Instead, she went for the throat. Lacey turned her own laptop toward me, showing a viral video Indira had just posted. My mother stood in the foyer of the Greenwich mansion, her face a mask of tearful, staged grief. My youngest daughter, Catherine, has suffered a total mental break, she sobbed to her thousands of followers. She's stolen priceless family heirlooms and vanished into the night. Please, if you see her, call us. She is a danger to herself. The fallout was instantaneous. My phone was flooded with vitriolic messages from aunts I hadn't seen in years and cousins who had always looked down on me. They called me ungrateful, a traitor to the blood, and a disgrace to the legacy. It was a public execution of my reputation, a suffocating compression designed to force me back into the cage. Lacey gripped her mug, her eyes flashing with anger. You have to fight back, Catherine. Post the photos of the car. Tell them about the insurance policy. Don't let her win this narrative. I looked at the messages, the words of people who had never bothered to know the real me, and felt a strange, detached calm. When the house is on fire, you don't stay inside to argue with the person who lit the match. You just get out and call the professionals. I remembered something my grandfather once told me. Character is like a sturdy oak tree, while reputation is merely its shadow. The shadow is what people think of you, but the tree is the real thing. Indira was attacking my shadow, but she couldn't touch my roots. I spent the next 3 hours in a state of clinical focus, ignoring the noise of the world to organize my evidence. I meticulously arranged the evidence folder, the high-resolution photos of my tampered brake lines, the digital copies of the forged signatures, and the $5 million life insurance policy that valued my death more than my life. I wasn't just a daughter being slandered on social media anymore. I was a state witness preparing for a grand jury. I didn't realize it then, but my silence was the most terrifying weapon I possessed. Lacey watched me, her expression shifting from worry to a profound, quiet respect. "You're really going through with this," she whispered. I nodded, my hand steady as I saved the final file. I wasn't doing this to hurt my mother or to seek a petty theatrical revenge. I was doing this so she would finally have to face the reflection she's been running from for 20 years. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to step out of the way and let them hit the ground. It's the only way they'll ever learn the weight of their own choices. In the United States, reporting insurance fraud and attempted physical harm isn't an act of disloyalty. It is a moral and civic necessity. I wasn't being an unnatural daughter. I was being a citizen who refused to be an accomplice to her own murder. I felt the weight of my past falling away, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of the law. I looked at the clock. It was time. The state police headquarters in Hartford would be open, and I had a story to tell that would make their Greenwich, hometown hero reputation crumble into dust. I picked up my coat, the heavy wool feeling like armor against the biting Connecticut wind. I caught my reflection in Lacey's hallway mirror. My face was pale, my eyes shadowed, but for the first time in my life, I didn't look like a shadow. I looked like the sun about to rise. I wasn't just a girl who had been kicked out of her home. I was the primary witness for a federal prosecution. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but I knew I was ready to meet it. The gray light of the morning felt like a clean slate as we walked to Lacey's car. I thought about the dining room in Greenwich, the clinking of crystal, and the wine-stained dress. All of that belonged to a different person. A girl who thought she owed her soul to people who didn't even value her life. That girl was gone. I took a deep breath of the salt-tinged air and felt a sense of peace that no mansion could ever provide. I was finally steering my own life into the storm. We drove through the quiet streets of New Haven, heading toward the highway. The heavy doors of the state police headquarters felt like the entrance to a new life, and I didn't hesitate to push them open. I knew that once I spoke, there would be no going back. But as I walked toward the front desk, I didn't feel afraid. I felt free. I was finally ready to present the final bill to the people who thought I was free. I left behind the sterile hallways of the precinct, the ink on my affidavit still wet, carrying a folder that contained the shattered remains of my mother's deception. While I walked toward Lacey's car, the morning air felt sharp and honest, a stark contrast to the suffocating luxury I had escaped. I knew that miles away, in the quiet, tree-lined streets of Greenwich, the world I once called home was beginning to go dark. The gears of justice were finally turning, and I was no longer the one trapped between them. Indira woke up that morning to a mansion that had suddenly turned into a silent, unresponsive stranger. The smart home systems, the lights, the climate control, the high-end security, were offline. My fraud report had acted like a digital guillotine, triggering immediate freezes on every account and credit line linked to my social security number. For the first time in decades, the house was cold. My mother stood in the foyer, frantically pressing buttons on her tablet, unaware that her clout was being systematically dismantled by the very daughter she had dismissed as clumsy and dependent. In the library, Soren stared at a glowing, access-denied screen with the hollow-eyed look of a man watching his last hope vanish. He attempted to wire funds to an offshore account to cover the gambling debts that were breathing down his neck, but the bank's security protocols, now fully alerted to the identity theft, blocked every move. I watched the remote server logs from my phone with a clinical, detached focus. They told me to be independent, but they forgot that their own independence was built on the back of my silence. The truth is a heavy burden, but a lie is a debt that eventually demands payment with interest. The panic inside the mansion wasn't just financial, it was existential. Looking back now, I realized that when the money stopped flowing, the masks began to slip. I haven't just been forgotten. I've been erased from their balance sheet, and without my name to hide behind, they were finally exposed. Have you ever wondered what happens to a perfect family when the golden curtains are stripped away? I wasn't there to see the walls closing in, but I could feel the tremor of their desperation through every frozen transaction. By mid-morning, the toxic loyalty that held the house together began to disintegrate. Seeing the ship taking on water, Cressida didn't stand by our mother. Instead, Indira caught her in the hallway, frantically stuffing family heirlooms and portable assets into a designer suitcase. The two women, who had stood united in their mockery of Catherine just 24 hours ago, were now screaming at each other. They traded accusations of greed and selfishness, their voices echoing through the darkened, silent rooms. Years of hidden resentments and stolen secrets were laid bare in the shadows of their own making. I sat in Lacey's car, looking at a photo of my father on my phone, the man whose insurance had been the catalyst for this nightmare. I didn't hate them. I pitied them. A family built on greed is just a group of strangers waiting for the lights to go out so they can rob each other. I hadn't lost a family. I had escaped a crime scene. I watched Soren try to bargain with Cressida, offering to stay silent about her theft if she took him with her. In that house, love was always just a transaction, and tonight, the price was too high for anyone to pay. I signed the final affidavit at the police station, my hands steady and my heart rhythmic. I told Lacey that I wasn't doing this out of anger or a desire for a theatrical revenge. I was doing this because the most dangerous thing you can do for someone you love is to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. Real love is honesty, even when it hurts like a physical wound. I was finally honoring my father's memory by refusing to let his name be used as a shield for their malice. The American dream is built on the foundation of merit and hard work. Yet my family had chosen a parasitic existence, feeding on the future of their own blood. You cannot build a castle on someone else's foundation and then act surprised when they decide to move the bricks. For too long, I was the brick they assumed would never move. I didn't realize it then, but my silence was the only thing keeping their world upright. Now that I've spoken, the collapse is inevitable. As I stood by the window of the station, I saw a convoy of black SUVs pulling out of the lot, their tires splashing through the puddles as they headed toward Greenwich. There were no sirens, just a quiet, purposeful momentum. I felt a sense of melancholy for the girl I used to be, the one who would have tried to fix this, but she was gone. I was now a witness to the truth. The air around me hummed with the weight of the justice that was about to knock on a door that had been locked for far too long. Looking at my reflection in the glass, I didn't see the ungrateful child Indira described. I saw a woman who had finally reclaimed her own narrative. Have you ever felt the peace that comes when you stop trying to save people who are determined to drown? I watched the SUVs disappear into the distance. The final bill was about to be presented, and I was no longer responsible for the total. I was free. The sirens were silent as they left, but the air around me hummed with the weight of the justice that was about to knock on a door that had been locked for too long. I sat in the passenger seat of Lacey's car, my fingers tracing the cold glass of the window, watching the Connecticut landscape blur into a streak of autumnal grays and greens. We were heading back to Greenwich, back to the mansion, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't going home. I was going to witness a reckoning. In the grand foyer of the mansion, the air was likely thick with the same lemon polish and lavender I had smelled for years. But the atmosphere had shifted from toxic elegance to blind panic. Indira and Soren were standing beneath the crystal chandelier, their voices echoing through the cold, darkened house. They were arguing over a designer bag stuffed with family heirlooms, a desperate attempt to salvage a lifestyle that was already underwater. The heavy oak doors, the ones that had always represented a barrier between me and the world, were suddenly rattled off their hinges. Federal agents and local police flooded into the light, their presence a stark, rhythmic intrusion into my mother's carefully curated reality. The charges were read with a clinical precision that cut through Indira's theatrical gasps. Identity theft, wire fraud, and the most chilling of all, the attempted murder charge for the tampered brake lines. I watched through the live feed Lacey had secured, seeing my mother try to play the vulnerable matriarch, her voice trembling as she claimed ignorance. But the agents didn't care about her porcelain skin or her Greenwich pedigree. They presented the digital logs, the recorded calls, and the forged signatures I had meticulously gathered. In America, the law does not care about the size of your mansion when your foundation is built on the bones of another person's future. The flashing blue and red lights reflected in the chandeliers, marking the end of an era of shadowed lies. I pulled up to the curb just as they were leading Soren out in handcuffs. I didn't scream. I didn't celebrate. I simply stood by the gate, a silent observer of the wreckage I had survived. Catherine was no longer the invisible pillar or the clumsy child. I was the ghost that had finally come back to haunt the house of glass. When Indira was led down the stone steps, her hair disheveled and her eyes wild with fury, she spotted me. "I raised you!" she screamed, her voice cracking against the cold morning air. "I gave you life! How can you do this to your own mother?" I walked toward her, stopping just out of reach of the officers. I looked at her not with hatred, but with a profound, detached compassion. "You gave me life, Mother, but you tried to trade it for a debt," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because I love the truth more than I fear your anger." I realized then that the most painful thing to lose is yourself in the process of loving someone too much, and forgetting that you are special too. By letting the law take its course, I was finally protecting the little girl I used to be, the one who had been told she was a parasite while she was being bled dry. Soren was pushed into a separate cruiser, his face a mask of cowardice and regret. He didn't look at me. I turned to the bank representative waiting on the sidewalk and handed over the heavy brass keys to the mansion. I had legally withdrawn my name as a guarantor and co-signer weeks ago, a strategic move that had finally processed. The house was no longer my responsibility. It was a foreclosed shell. I was finally, legally, and spiritually unchained from the bricks and mortar of my own oppression. Character is fate, and tonight, the house was finally being reclaimed by the reality it had tried to avoid. I looked at Indira one last time as the cruiser door was about to close. "You told me to be independent, to pay my own bills," I said, the words feeling light in my mouth. "I've paid mine with my sweat, my tears, and my silence. Now, Mother, the law is here to help you pay yours." I didn't wait for her response. I didn't need the final word. Her silence as the car drove away was the only closure I required. I walked back to Lacey's car, my posture regal and my heart rhythmic. The bridge was gone, and the path ahead was clear. Lacey drove us away from Greenwich, heading toward a small cottage by the shore where the air was salt clean and the horizon was vast. I looked at my hands as the sun began to break through the clouds, illuminating the Connecticut coastline in a brilliant golden light. They weren't shaking anymore. The red stain on my dress from the night before was a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of a new dawn. I had survived the banquet of humiliation and the trap of the family, and I had come out the other side with my soul intact. We pulled over at a sun-drenched coastal overlook, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks a soothing, honest melody. I stood at the edge of the cliff, breathing in the freedom I had fought so hard to earn. In the end, we aren't defined by the people who tried to break us, but by the peace we find once we stop trying to fix them. I wasn't just independent. I was whole. The final bill had been settled, and for the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone a single thing.